Hi, so I'm Gabby Samuel. I'm a research fellow at King's College London in the UK, and I'm talking today about new forensic DNA technologies, the search for ethical boundaries. And when we start to think about ethical boundaries, we need to go back to older DNA technologies and how ethical boundaries were formed in that case. So the introduction of forensic DNA technologies at the end of the last century, so here I'm referring to STR-based DNA profiling and database technologies, while that they were seen to offer a huge benefit to police fighting crime and identifying suspected perpetrators, notwithstanding their limitations, there was when they became quite widespread, there was also a widespread concern about the ethical and social issues that they raised. And the main concern related to how to balance the potential benefits of this technology with the intrusions of human and civil rights in terms of privacy, discrimination, and surveillance. And so the way that this balance was achieved was by drawing on the coding versus non-coding DNA distinction, which acted as quite a useful ethical boundary. And at the time it was promoted that the coding regions of DNA were important because they provided information about what a person looked like, their observable characteristics and other such traits. Whereas the non-coding DNA, which is where the STR segments are normally found, was considered more junk DNA, so DNA that didn't serve a useful purpose. And so while it was known then, and even more well known now, that actually the non-coding region can actually tell you something about an individual's characteristics, either because it's related to the regulation of specific genes in the coding region or because it's inherited together with them in certain trunks of DNA. There was this belief that in spite of this, it did offer, this coding and non-coding boundary, offered a really good ethical boundary in terms of what can be used in forensics in terms of DNA analysis and what couldn't. And only looking at the non-coding regions was seen as less privacy intruding than those of the coding regions. And in fact, many countries now have this boundary enshrined within their legislation. For example, Germany and Austria until really recently could only use DNA analysis for forensic purposes on non-coding regions of DNA. Now, the issue with new technologies is that, and ones that don't rely on STR profiling, is that they rely on different DNA analysis. So just, for example, mainly SNPs type analysis or methylation sites, which may be found either in the coding or the non-coding regions. And so they really complicate those ethical boundaries that were seen to hold quite true. So we can no longer use the physicality of DNA as a useful marker for what is deemed ethically acceptable when we're thinking about when and how we should use these technologies. We need to look to other newer boundaries. And so I want to look at how this can start to be thought about, looking at two specific technologies. One is forensic DNA phenotyping and one is forensic genetic genealogy. And I think both of those technologies my wonderful colleagues have either probably mentioned before I've been speaking or maybe will mention after. But what I want to do is introduce these technologies very briefly, start to think about the ethical and social issues they raise, and then just begin the process of thinking about how we can start to think about ethical boundaries that can be formed from this and from what we know. So what I want to show is that we need to move away from using the physicality of DNA as an ethical boundary and move towards thinking about the purpose of why we're going to be using a technology as a now more suitable ethical boundary. So forensic DNA phenotyping analyzes DNA from a crime scene stain or from an unidentified human remain in a way that it can predict likely externally visible characteristics of a suspected perpetrator or a missing person. So here it can predict by geographical ancestry or skin color, eye color, hair color to the appearance of a person, and also can predict age as well. And it's a very investigative type technology, so it's used to help identify a particular suspected perpetrator. And it's really important to remember that it's probabilistic, and the probability or how probable the findings of FDB analysis are is likely also dependent on the type of test testing. So for pigmentation, for hair colour, eye colour and skin colour, predictions can be quite high, but for example male pattern baldness or freckle prediction, the predictions are much lower. And there are a range of limitations that are related to the technology that I'll talk about in a little bit. Most countries don't have explicit regulation relating to FDP. So FDP generally relies on the use of SMPs, and most legislation is still from the kind of SDR generation, and so it's sometimes difficult to know whether FDP is legal or not in those countries. But a few countries have explicitly legislated again for it. In Europe, this includes the Netherlands, Germany, and Slovakia. Now, supporters of FDP argue that there's an ethical imperative to use this as long as there are suitable safety and accountability measures to try and identify perpetrators or suspected perpetrators of a crime, and that it can almost act as a biological eyewitness. But critiques of the technology have highlighted a whole range of ethical and social issues. Now, I don't want to run through all of these ethical and social issues, mainly because I don't have time, although I could happily talk about them for hours at a time. But I'm just going to pick out some key ones that will then relate to how we need to think about ethical boundaries. So the first one is related to the fact that FDP is a predictive technology. So as I was saying earlier, there are a whole range of limitations that relate to FDP, not least because of the collection and preservation of DNA and how that's handled, issues of contamination, the genetic markers used, the fact that the way someone looks may be not related to their genetics, the fact that we don't have standards in place in terms of how to interpret FDP findings. So all of these, on top of the fact that FDP findings are only probabilistic, raise a number of limitations about its use. But what's important here is the fact that within this and amongst this, there is a concern that forensic DNA evidence is often being imagined as a truth machine. So it enjoys a very, very high level of public trust. And there is a concern that because of this, when police officers, stakeholders, receive findings from FDP, that they would place too much trust in them, given with all these limitations, and that therefore they could inappropriately use these FD findings in cases, and this may lead to unnecessary false leads or other types of issues. And this relates slightly to the biological eyewitness that I don't want to go into too much, but if we're going to analogize it, FDP to eyewitnesses, that analogy forgets the fact that eyewitnesses we know may produce inaccurate statements, and this is something that's well known in law enforcement. But for FDP, that same understanding of what the findings means isn't there, because so much truth and trust is placed in DNA findings. I'm going to skip over cost effectiveness, but I want to think about discrimination just briefly, because I'm pretty sure that some of my wonderful colleagues will be speaking about this or have already spoken about this today, and that they're much brighter and more wonderful than I am in terms of articulating the issues. But the important thing to remember is that by the very nature of this technology, it is discriminatory. It is trying to hone down the suspect population, from where the suspected perpetrator might reside in, right? So what you want to do is move towards a minority suspect population, and by doing this, when you're doing this along already political and social tensions and lines that are already fraught, as is very often the case with biogeographical ancestry, because you're going down ethnic minority lines, then it starts to raise a whole range of discriminatory and stigmatization issues. And this all sits within a whole structurally racist society that a lot of European societies are part of. And discrimination can take many forms. For example, an FD finding that is likely African origin could easily be used or interpreted by a police officer as we are looking for somebody that is black, so it can lead to an increase in racial profiling. And given this and given lots of other issues with discrimination, many scholars are concerned about FDP being used as a reification of the mistaken belief of biological basis of race. And some say that FDP is actually masquerading as racial testing. So there's a lot of discrimination issues there. And then in terms of privacy, and again, I think this will be talked about in the meeting in much more detail than I have time for here, but not safe to say that there are lots of privacy issues in terms of creating these suspect populations from FDP. Creating suspect populations isn't new to law enforcement officers. The concern is that if FDP does it too much or always honing down on the same types of suspects, at the expense of other types of population groups. And when you become a suspect population, there's always concerns around privacy because the police may look into you more than other populations. And then there's also privacy concerns slightly different in terms of the types of traits that you're looking for, externally visible characteristics, biogeographical ancestry, age, may also link to internal characteristics. They may also be able to tell you something about the person that you didn't already know. In a very easy example, somebody with red hair and pale skin is more likely to be likely to develop skin cancer. So those types of issues. I mean, I don't have time to go into any of the other issues, but my email is on the bottom of all these slides, so please do email me and I can send you papers where we've looked at these in much more detail. But safe to say, these are generally issues around privacy and discrimination and surveillance which have reared their head again when thinking about FDP. And so if we want to think about ethical safe spaces or ethical boundaries that can be drawn to encapsulate ethical safe spaces, certain things do jump up that have been written about in the literature that we've written about. It's important that if we're going to use these technologies, that the tests are valid and reliable in both the scientific and the forensic sense, to ensure that there aren't to mitigate as much as we can against the misinterpretation of findings. It's important that only those that will have a good understanding of FDP kind of conduct the tests and communicate those to law enforcement officers to really ensure that information and communication feeds through and people kind of understand what those findings mean. FDP should only be carried out on or predictive tests for those traits that are externally visible, so that they have an internal-external boundary there in terms of traits that are looked for. But I just want to mention here that these boundaries are very, very diffuse. So if we're only looking at externally visible characteristics, we can't really say that it's only those that are socially sensitive or not sensitive, because, for example, biogeographical ancestry may be seen as externally visible but may be seen as socially sensitive and may not always fit in the ethical safe space or may not always act as a good ethical boundary. And we've seen this in the legislation of Germany that doesn't allow biogeographical ancestry testing, even though it's allowed in other countries. And so there are lots of issues there in terms of the diffuseness of the boundary. And so whizzing through, let's now look at another technology and then compare them at the end. So this is forensic genetic genealogy. So different, it's also investigative, as is FDP, and it also uses SMP analysis. It involves the analysis of over 500,000 SMPs and then getting an SMP profile from DNA left at a crime scene or a missing person case, and then uploading that DNA to a genetic genealogy database to try and identify a close relative or a second, third, or more distant cousin. And once a match has been found, then the law enforcement officers or whoever's doing the testing can work with genealogists to try and identify who that person is, and then eventually work their way through to finding out who the suspected perpetrator is. And genetic genealogy or genealogy searching is not new to law enforcement authorities, but the rapid increase in genetic genealogy databases has made it more attractive. So the technology has mainly been used in the US, although there's one case in Sweden, and it's been used to solve about 200 cases. The main sites where law enforcement officers have been allowed to access in terms of searching for matches are GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Solves. So this picture here is the Golden Gate Killer, which is probably the most well-known case that used this technology, and they used GEDmatch to upload the DNA to try and identify the match. And there's a whole range of private or market investment in this technology. So Parabon Labs and Bode and Othram have all got into marketing this technology to law enforcement officers. Now, there does seem to be general support for the technology, but there are a range of ethical and social issues, again, that are raised about the technology. And I've written a lot more about this, so please email me again if you want to hear about these in more detail. But just to point out the key concerns here is that privacy, again, is a key issue. So here what we want to think about is, do users of these sites have a privacy expectation in terms of law enforcement officers coming along and using those sites? There are issues at stake here. For example, there have been data breaches. There was one back in July for GEDmatch. And there are other issues in terms of when these cases have been carried out. Some information has been released to the media, not genetic information, but information about the case, because genetic informants have released information to the media. And then there's also a privacy issue of the fact that it is analysing an SNP profile, and SNP profiles can tell you a lot about health information about a particular person, or internal characteristics about a particular person. Even though that's not the main reason for this technology, there is that issue there. I'm not going to talk about biased data sets or data protection issues, although those are key concerns as well. But just to mention that the inappropriate use of forensic genetic genealogy, in the sense that instances may arise because of the international nature of users of genetic genealogy coming across the world, but actually the technology only be used in certain countries. So there are examples of, for example, genetic genealogy users opposing the fact of their DNA being searched against by law enforcement officers that may be able to identify a perpetrator, and that perpetrator be subject to the death penalty. Another example is infanticide, where you have different legal rules in terms of how you treat mothers who have killed their children that are more lenient in some countries and not others. So there are international concerns about users being on the database and only wanting their database to be searched against by law enforcement officers under specific circumstances. And so if we think about forming ethical boundaries in this technology and what the ethical space will look like, consent has come up as a key boundary in terms of that can prevent many of these ethical issues. However, when we think about consent, there are a range of issues that are at stake here, not least because many people, we've done a range of interviews with people, and they all have very wide range of different perspectives about what consent should look like in practice. So that's one big issue. Another big issue is that users are consenting to their DNA being used, but it's their relatives that may or may not be affected, some distant as well, in the investigation. And there are other issues of consent that I don't have time to go into. But again, what you got here is a very diffuse boundary in terms of what the ethical boundary should be, but that it might work as an arbitrary distinction. And one really interesting thing to say about consent is that when we conducted our interviews, many saw consent as an ethical panacea to solve all the ethical problems of this technology, and they almost responsibilized users as, well, you can choose to upload your DNA or not, it's your responsibility given the consequences and all these ethical issues, rather than seeing consent as one part of the dealing with the ethical and social issues related to forensic genetic genealogy, and there being these all other issues that also need to be talked about. And again, please ask me questions about that if you wish. And then so there's other ethical boundaries coming from the issues that have arisen. Lab accreditation is one, given the private investment and marketing in this arena, this political economy, and also maybe only searching for closer relatives, only up to third cousins, given the effect that this may have on relatives and cousins. And so the overlapping take-home message from my very quick presentation that's probably gone way over time now is that I've shown that we need to move away from the physicality of DNA in terms of drawing ethical boundaries again around new technologies, to looking more about the purpose, and how we can formulate these new ethical boundaries is arbitrary. Useful but problematic, but it's a good place to start thinking about. So when we're thinking about FDP, then validity and reliability are key ethical boundaries that can be used, as are the external-internal trait boundary, but also we need to consider social acceptance. And it's also worth noting that discrimination will only be partially addressed, misinterpretation issues will also be partially addressed. And as part of a Visage project that I've been working on for the past 3 years, we've spoken further about the recommendations that we could put in place to deal with this. For genetic genealogy, consent is a key issue or a key boundary that can be thought about, but this too is still problematic for a whole range of reasons. And very finally, because I know I've completely run over time, there are some general boundaries that we can think about for both these technologies, which we should start to think about whether they can be generalized across all or as new DNA technologies come on the market. So only using technologies for serious crimes and or missing persons cases, given the propensity for ethical and social issues to be raised during their use. Only using these technologies in exceptional circumstances when other means have not produced any findings for law enforcement, other police means, and only using these tests through regulated laboratories with proper standardized practices. And then umbrelling all of this is the importance of oversight and regulation. So that's my swift run through. Thank you very much for bearing with me. I'm very sorry for running over by 5 minutes, but please email me or if you've got any questions, and I think I'll be there at the live panel on Friday.